Nobody in this video married for love. For the better part of 1,000 years, a British royal wedding operated as a treaty with better catering. It sealed alliances and put a legally unimpeachable heir into a cradle on schedule. What the groom privately wanted never appeared in the paperwork. That gap between duty and desire produced some of the strangest marriages in British history, because a striking number of royal grooms privately wanted other men. These are the stories of the women who signed those contracts anyway. Among them you'll find a 12-year-old French bride who grew up to raise an army, invade England, and pull the crown off her own husband's head. There's a Danish queen whose husband signed letters to his favorite courtier as "thy dear dad and husband." One granddaughter of Queen Victoria sailed to Canada as a married princess and learned, mid-tour, that her father-in-law annulled her marriage without asking her. Another granddaughter of Victoria walked in on her husband with a servant and later told her family that no boy in the palace stayed safe from him. And those are just the headliners. A ground rule before the first story. Gay and bisexual are modern words, and for most of this timeline they did not exist. Medieval Europe filed same-sex acts under sin rather than identity. And nearly every man you're about to meet also slept with his wife, because producing an heir defined the job. Some of these cases rest on surviving love letters. Others rest on slander written by men who wanted a king destroyed. We'll grade the evidence as we go, since the difference matters, and since the gossip is half the fun either way. Let's meet the wives, starting on a beach in Cyprus in 1191. Berengaria of Navarre holds a record no other English queen wants. She never set foot in England while her husband ruled it. Born around 1165 into the royal house of Navarre, she married Richard I, the Lionheart, on May 12, 1191, in Limassol, Cyprus, because the Third Crusade paused for nobody's wedding. Her honeymoon took place inside a war. The rumors about Richard predate the marriage. Back in 1187, the chronicler Roger of Howden recorded that Richard and King Philip II Augustus of France grew so demonstratively close that at night the bed did not separate them. Hold the gasp, because historians have fought over that sentence for decades. John Gillingham argues that two kings sharing a bed in the 12th century performed a recognized political ritual, a public display of trust and alliance with no erotic charge, something closer to a signed photo op than a scandal. William Burgwinkle and Jean Fleury look at the wider pattern of evidence and land somewhere very different. Part of that pattern involves a hermit. In 1195, this holy man reportedly confronted the king with a warning to be mindful of the destruction of Sodom and abstain from what is unlawful. Richard answered with public penance, and then, briefly, with a return to his wife's bed, which suggests the rebuke landed somewhere close to home. He also left no acknowledged illegitimate children, a real oddity for a medieval warrior king. None of it settles the question. And scholars warn that gay maps poorly onto a world organized around sin and penance. Contested but plausible. That's the honest grade. Berengaria's experience needs no grading. After the Crusade, she saw almost nothing of her husband, and even once Richard walked free from captivity in Germany, he ignored her until churchmen pressured him into cohabiting. His death in 1199 handed her a second career. 3 full decades spent fighting his successor, King John, for the dowry and income the English crown legally owed her. She settled in Le Mans as Dowager Queen and lived until 1230, a Queen of England who never saw England, widowed by a man she barely knew. Isabella of France arrived in England as a 12-year-old bride and left her deepest impression with an invasion fleet. Born in 1295, she married King Edward II on January 25, 1308, and received a preview of the entire marriage at her own coronation banquet, where Edward spent the celebration beside his favorite, Piers Gaveston, while his child bride sat ignored. Humiliation arrived on day one and set the tone for 2 decades. Gaveston occupied a place at court that no royal mistress ever matched. Edward raised him to Earl of Cornwall and treated him, in the eyes of contemporaries, as the true partner of his reign. The author of the Vita Edwardi Secundi compared the bond to the biblical love of David and Jonathan, and wrote that Edward loved him beyond measure and above his wife, while another chronicler claimed the infatuation drove the king to reject Isabella's bed outright. Chronicle after chronicle circles the same observation. The queen came second. What exactly the two men did behind closed doors keeps historians arguing. Pierre Chaplet read the relationship as an adoptive brotherhood, a sworn fraternal pact between comrades rather than a romance. Ormrod, Seymour Phillips, and Ian Mortimer weigh the same evidence and rate a sexual or romantic relationship as highly probable. Even so, calling Edward simply gay fails on the arithmetic. Between 1312 and 1321, he fathered 4 children with Isabella, plus an illegitimate son named Adam Fitzroy. So his appetites clearly ran in more than one direction. The marriage even worked for a while. Those 4 children arrived during a stretch of genuine cooperation between husband and wife. Then Hugh Despenser the Younger entered the picture, and the cooperation died. Despenser refused to settle for the king's affection. He wanted the queen erased, and he worked at it methodically, alienating Edward from Isabella, seizing her lands, and removing her children from her care. Convention expected a medieval queen in that position to pray and endure. Isabella chose another route entirely. Slipping away to France, she formed an alliance with the exiled Baron Roger Mortimer that turned romantic and political in equal measure, assembled an invasion force, and in 1326 landed in England and deposed her own husband. Contemporaries branded her the she-wolf of France, an insult that has aged into something closer to a title of respect, which feels about right for the girl once ignored at her own coronation feast. Not every entry on this list survives scrutiny, and this one mostly doesn't. Richard II married Anne of Bohemia on January 20, 1382, and their marriage, though childless, ranks among the closest and most affectionate royal unions of the Middle Ages. The trouble attached itself to the king's friendship with Robert de Vere, 9th Earl of Oxford, on whom Richard heaped wealth, titles, and affection, eventually elevating him to Duke of Ireland. Watching from the sidelines, the hostile chronicler Thomas Walsingham accused the king of improper familiarity with de Vere, a closeness that disregarded royal dignity and social norms. Modern historians handle Walsingham with tongs. Nigel Saul points out that in the late 14th century, accusing a king of sexual deviance or unmanly softness counted as standard political ammunition, and the rebellious barons known as the Lords Appellant wanted an excuse to purge an unpopular favorite. No personal letters back the charge, and no behavioral evidence corroborates it. The strongest counterargument sits in the ruins of a palace. When Anne died in 1394, Richard's grief cut so deep that he ordered the destruction of Sheen, the royal residence where she died. Men fake many things, but demolishing your own palace is an expensive way to fake love. His second marriage explains royal weddings better than any lecture could. Isabella of Valois arrived at the ceremony on October 31, 1396, aged 6. The marriage existing purely to seal a truce with France, and Richard's enemies deposed and murdered him before his little queen reached adulthood. The rumors about his sexuality fueled rebellion against his crown rather than misery in his marriages. Of everyone in this video, Richard may be the rare husband whom the gossip hurt worse than it hurt either wife. Most entries here require careful hedging, and then there's King James. Anne of Denmark married James VI of Scotland, the future James I of England, in 1589, first by proxy on August 20, and then in person on November 23. Across his long reign, James attached himself, in succession, to a run of handsome male favorites: Esme Stuart, Duke of Lennox; Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset; and George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, the great consuming attachment of his later years. The evidence comes straight from the king's own pen. Writing to Buckingham, James signed himself, "Thy dear dad and husband," addressed Villiers as his "sweet child and wife," and in one letter stated flatly, "I desire only to live in this world for your sake." Courtiers noticed everything. Sir Anthony Weldon's Memoir of the Court describes James leaning on his favorites' necks and kissing them in public, behavior nobody bothered to hide because the King of England apparently saw no reason to hide it. Alan Stewart, David M. Bergeron, and Michael B. Young all reach the same verdict. James's romantic and emotional desires pointed at men. The live debate concerns consummation, with some scholars suggesting his strict theological convictions kept these attachments intense but physically chaste, and others finding the physical dimension undeniable. Labels stay slippery even here, at the best documented entry on the list, because James maintained an active sexual relationship with Anne through the first 2 decades of the marriage and fathered 7 children with her. Anne's story reads as a slow fade rather than a sudden betrayal. Her early marriage combined physical intimacy with real political partnership, and for years the Danish queen operated near the center of her husband's world. Carr changed that, and Villiers finished the job, absorbing the king so completely that Anne found herself pushed out of the inner political sphere. After the birth of her last child in 1607 and the death of her son Prince Henry in 1612, she and James lived largely separate lives, and she built her own artistically influential court at Somerset House and Greenwich, a world of her own making. James treated her with formal respect until her death in 1619, which amounts to the consolation prize of a queen whose rivals wore beards. Mary cried through her own wedding continuously in front of everyone. On November 4, 1677, the 15-year-old princess married her cousin William of Orange, a cold and reserved foreigner, and spent the ceremony in tears. The early years in the Netherlands did little to dry them, strained by William's emotional distance and his public affair with Elizabeth Villiers. While the marriage's childlessness caused Mary deep spiritual anguish, William's closest bonds belonged to 2 Dutch courtiers. Hans Willem Bentinck, later Earl of Portland, came first. Arnold Just van Keppel, later Earl of Albemarle, absorbed the king's lavish patronage in the 1690s. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688 put William and Mary on the English throne, Jacobite pamphleteers set to work, printing satires and broadsides accusing the foreign king of sodomy with his favorites. Propaganda engineered to paint him as morally corrupt and un-English. Biographers Henri and Barbara van der Zee, along with Stephen B. Baxter, warn against swallowing any of it whole, since political enemies routinely weaponized sodomy accusations against unpopular rulers. And yet the record contains real ambiguities. William's letters to Bentinck carry an emotional intensity beyond standard 17th century friendship, and the money and favor he poured on the much younger Keppel set the court murmuring. On the other side of the ledger sit a documented mistress and a grief nobody could have staged. Most modern historians settle on a portrait of an intensely private man whose deepest attachments formed with male comrades in arms inside a military world. Mary's arc bends upward, which almost nothing else in this video does. Over the years, her initial dread matured into devotion and loyalty, and she governed as a highly effective regent whenever William campaigned abroad. Smallpox killed her suddenly in 1694 at 32. William collapsed under the loss and wrote of losing the best wife that ever man had. Whatever he felt for Bentinck and Keppel, nobody at court doubted that grief. Princess Louise ranked as Queen Victoria's most artistic and unconventional daughter, which set her marriage up to look promising on paper. The paper lied. On March 21, 1871, she wed John Campbell, Marquess of Lorne and future 9th Duke of Argyll, and London society started whispering almost immediately. Because Lorne moved through the capital's artistic, bohemian, homosocial circles, the same networks widely associated with Victorian queer subcultures, and the gossip about his sexuality never faded. Proof in the courtroom sense does not exist, for a structural reason. From 1885, the Labouche Amendment criminalized homosexuality, forcing men in Lorne's position into extreme secrecy. Diaries stayed unwritten and letters fed the fireplace, leaving historians an archival silence rather than a paper trail. Biographers Jehanny Wake and Lucinda Hawksley treat his orientation as a highly plausible explanation for the marriage's well-documented physical estrangement and its childlessness. Sean Brady, a historian of Victorian masculinity and gender, pushes back on rigid labels, noting that aristocratic bachelors of the era lived along a continuum of aesthetic and homosocial attachments that resisted marital domesticity without leaving evidence of anything physical. The marriage itself ran on two tracks. In Canada, where Lorne served as Governor-General from 1878 to 1883, the couple performed their public roles successfully. Back in Britain, they drifted into largely separate lives, with Louise cultivating independent artistic friendships and drawing rumors of her own affairs, including one involving the sculptor Joseph Edgar Boehm. Distance, though, never hardened into abandonment. When Lorne entered his final illness in 1914, Louise nursed him attentively to the end, an estranged wife who declined to act like one. Losing a marriage while on a different continent takes real bureaucratic efficiency. Princess Marie-Louise, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria through Princess Helena, married Prince Aribert of Anhalt on July 6, 1891, and spent December 1900 on an official visit to Canada. While she toured abroad, her father-in-law, the reigning Duke of Anhalt, exercised his sovereign prerogative and annulled the marriage on December 13, without consulting her and without warning. The reason moved through every royal household in Europe. The court had caught Aribert in a compromising sexual position with a male attendant. No trial transcripts survive from any of it, because no trial ever happened. A ducal decree required no courtroom and no explanation. Royal historians, Greg King among them, confirm that Aribert's liaisons with men triggered the annulment, a catalyst nobody inside European royal circles disputed, and Queen Victoria, reportedly furious at his treatment of her granddaughter, threw her weight behind Marie-Louise's immediate return to England. Marie-Louise later admitted immense relief at escaping the marriage. Even so, she regarded her wedding vows as sacred and never remarried. Dropping of Anhalt from her name, she reverted to her British styling as Princess Marie-Louise and filled the next 5.5 decades with charitable work and royal duties in London, surviving all the way into the reign of Elizabeth II. Her 1956 memoir carries the title My Memories of Six Reigns, the quiet flex of a woman who outlived nearly everyone who wronged her. Her family called her Ducky, and her marriage produced the bluntest quote in this entire video. Princess Victoria Melita of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, born in 1876 to Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, and a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, married her paternal first cousin, Grand Duke Ernest Louis of Hesse, on April 19, 1894. Everyone called him Ernie, and almost nothing about the marriage worked. In 1897, returning from a trip to Romania, Victoria Melita caught her husband in bed with a male domestic servant. What she later confided to her family spares nobody. No boy was safe, from the stable hands to the kitchen help. He slept quite openly with them all. Historians Michael J. Sullivan and John Vanderkiste record that Ernie's preference for men circulated as an open secret at the Hessian court, and that by the cynical rules of turn-of-the-century aristocracy, his real offense lay not in the liaisons themselves, but in conducting them inside his wife's own household. Discretion formed the entire social contract, and Ernie skipped that clause. The couple produced 2 children, a daughter named Elizabeth who died of typhoid in childhood, and a stillborn son, so the marriage piled grief on top of grievance. Queen Victoria blocked any talk of divorce, dreading a dynastic scandal, which left Victoria Melita trapped until the old queen died in January 1901. On December 21 of that same year, the couple divorced, and Europe's royal courts clutched their collective pearls. Several of them ostracized Victoria Melita for a time, a punishment she answered in 1905 by marrying her maternal first cousin, Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich of Russia, a match Tsar Nicholas II punished in turn with temporary banishment from the Russian imperial court. Ducky did not do quiet. Prince George, Duke of Kent, fourth son of King George V, arrived at his wedding with a considerable past. Biographers, socialite memoirs, and aristocratic accounts document a hedonistic, sexually fluid life. His documented and rumored male partners include the playwright Noel Coward, the Argentine socialite Jorge de Gallardo, and the art historian Anthony Blunt. Women appear on the list too, most notably Indira Rajah, Maharani of Cooch Behar, with whom he pursued an illicit romance in the late 1920s, and the American socialite Kiki Preston. Interwar aristocratic London ran on this brand of libertinism, and George ran hardest. Enter Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, whom he married on November 29, 1934. Some biographers argue that Queen Mary and court officials engineered the match deliberately, betting that a sophisticated bride would steady an erratic prince. Historians Deborah Cadbury and Giles Brandreth place George's bisexuality within that wider interwar culture, and modern biographical consensus accepts his male partners as fact. The only live argument concerns whether marriage truly ended the affairs or merely drove them into deeper discretion. Against most expectations, the marriage flourished. Marina, urbane and cosmopolitan, reportedly understood exactly whom she married and approached her husband's bohemian temperament with clear-eyed pragmatism. Together they became a glamorous, genuinely affectionate fixture of the royal family and produced 3 children: Prince Edward, Princess Alexandra, and Prince Michael. Then came August 1942, when George's military aircraft crashed in Scotland and killed him, leaving Marina a widow at 35, cut down not by scandal, but by war. Every other marriage on this list belongs to the age of oil paint and engraving. Cameras caught this one in color, often through the husband's own lens. Princess Margaret married Anthony Armstrong Jones, a photographer, on May 6, 1960. Over the following decades, the interior designer Nikki Haslam and others publicly claimed past romantic or sexual involvements with him, and Armstrong Jones, later Earl of Snowdon, addressed the question exactly once with any memorability. "I didn't fall in love with boys, but a few men have been in love with me." Read that line twice, and notice it denies nothing. Anne de Courcy's authorized 2008 biography, written with unrestricted access to his personal letters, diaries, and interviews, documents Snowdon's sexual fluidity within the bohemian artistic subculture of 1950s and 1960s London. Context matters here. Homosexuality remained illegal in Britain until 1967, so ambiguity worked as armor as much as style, and biographers today read Snowdon less through modern binary labels than as a product of mid-century creative circles, where experimentation across gender lines raised no eyebrows internally, even while it courted prison externally. The marriage burned hot and then just burned. Early years of mutual intellectual and sexual attraction gave way to affairs on both sides, and the collision of Snowdon's bohemian independence and reported infidelities with Margaret's own liaisons generated a volatility the palace could not contain. They separated in 1976 and divorced in 1978, the first divorce of a senior British royal since Margaret Tudor's in 1527. 451 years passed between senior royal divorces, and this couple ended the streak in front of the world's press. You may have arrived here expecting names from current headlines, so we'll handle that directly. Tabloids, such as the National Enquirer and the Globe, along with anonymous blind item websites, have for decades published sensational claims about secret same-sex relationships involving living royals, including King Charles III, Prince William, and Prince Harry. Not one of those claims rests on primary sources, and neither credible journalism nor academic scholarship backs any of them. Historians classify them, without exception, as unverified. The phenomenon itself, though, carries a long pedigree. Jacobite broadsides smeared William III, Chronicle libels smeared Richard II, and the modern tabloid performs the same old trick with faster distribution, selling sexual scandal about a crown to demystify it or simply cash in on it. The weapon predates the printing press. Only the delivery system changed.